Today I just want to talk a bit about what it means to enter somewhere. When we enter somewhere, we usually are crossing some sort of threshold. So when we enter a building, we are leaving the outside. When we show our ID badge or our key fob at work or at the gym, it means we're allowed to enter into a place that not all people are permitted to go. When these kids enter a new grade, it marks the beginning of a new phase of their learning. And when an actor enters a scene, they come on stage or on screen for some intentional reason. They're either to speak, to support, to sing, or simply be a part of the backdrop or the landscape. In life, some people enter into our lives and they have a deep and profound impact. They enrich our journey, and we can no longer imagine life without them. And I would say that was the case with all the people who encountered Jesus. The Gospels tell many, many stories of Jesus entering places and entering into people's lives. In the Gospel today, he enters a village on the border of Galilee and Samaria, somewhere, we're not exactly sure where. But the Gospel makes it pretty clear that it's more than just a literal stepping across a border. It was an entry into the lives of some very, very deeply troubled people, this group of people with leprosy. And we see along the way that Jesus understands the situation that they're going through. Leprosy in the Bible is this all-encompassing term which kind of is for a variety of skin diseases and also different types of fungus that might be found in a home or on certain things. But without going into a lengthy dissertation, leprosy was always considered highly contagious and something that needed to be isolated from everything else. So the priests were the ones who were experts at diagnosing leprosy. Not the job I would want, but if they declared someone had leprosy, that person was no longer permitted to worship. They were no longer permitted to live as part of the community. They had to steer clear of everyone. So they were often sent into exile, and if you were walking and you encountered someone along the way, you had to raise your hands and sort of say, leprosy, leprosy, or unclean, unclean. You had to announce to others your status so that everyone could stay clear of you and not touch you, because if they touched you, you'd be contagious yourself. To know, though, there were short-term skin diseases that could be cured, and if that was the case, the priest would simply do some sort of an examination, and then if they no longer saw any leprosy, the priest would pronounce you healed and restored to community life. And so our story today begins with a group of 10 lepers, supposedly on the edge of a town, which sort of gives sort of the idea that this is some sort of colony of people suffering from long-term illness. We know nothing about their lives before they got to this point where they're living together. Perhaps some of them were wealthy and would never have hung around the people they're stuck with now. Perhaps some of them had been homeless. Perhaps some of them had been criminals. Perhaps some of them had been fine, upstanding citizens. Perhaps some were extremely well educated, and perhaps some were completely illiterate and really not so sharp. But whatever the case, I'm sure it would have been painful for any single one of them to walk into that leper colony for the very first time, because it meant they would have been cut off from the life that they had known previously. From then on, they were going to most likely be cut off in quarantine from relatives, friends, neighbors, and in some sense, the entire world, and often for the rest of their life. So when you entered a leper colony, your status really didn't matter. Your previous job didn't matter. Your wealth didn't matter. Your possessions didn't matter. All the barriers that the world had set up before on the outside world no longer mattered, because every single person in a leper colony suffered from the same thing, from a common disease that was not only physical, in fact, social was really the disease they were experiencing. But when all of a sudden people have the same things, the previous things that had separated you, like race and culture and sexuality and religion, are not so important anymore. All of a sudden in a leper colony, you learn to become a community because that's all you have left. When we're down in D.C. with the 8th grade kids ministering to the homeless on the streets, what we find so often is that the people there are so generous in looking out for their friends and neighbors on the street. They're always pointing you in the direction of Joe or Judy, who lives down at the park there. Go and help them. Lepers, though, in Jesus' day, would always keep their distance. And at times, what they would do, if they were daring, if they saw someone off in the distance, they would call out and beg and appeal to someone. And that's what they do in the story today. They call out and shout from a distance to Jesus, "Jesus, have mercy. Give us some help." And it says Jesus came a little bit closer and saw them, which is more than just physically seeing them with his eyes. In the scripture, what it means is that he understood their hurts, their hopes. He understood their situation and their plight completely. So quickly he shouts back to them, "Go to the priest, all 10 of you, and show yourselves to him." And we can commend them for starting and going out to see the priest, because it appears to be an act of obedience. It appears to be an act of discipleship. So as they go, what it says is, as they go, they all were healed. These people who had lived together in a place where status, wealth, and sexuality and social standing didn't make any difference, every single one of them was healed. What's interesting, though, is how 9 of them continue on their journey toward the priest. They realized in going to the priest they had much to gain. Remember, by going to the priest, they can get him to announce to the world, to the community, they are now clean and allowed back as part of the society, allowed back to be a part of the community. And so perhaps that meant a return to their privileged status, perhaps it meant a return to wealth, a return to a better life, or simply a return to normal living with all the things that normal living is involved. But by going to the priest, what we need to see is the emphasis is on embracing the world as we've always known it. And the truth is, Luke wants us to pay attention to the world as Jesus knows it, the world as Jesus sees it. It's kind of ironic that there's one who chose not to go to the priest. And you know why? What would actually happen if that one showed up to the priest? That one, if he showed up to the priest would have still said, "You are utterly unacceptable." He was unacceptable because he was a Samaritan, and in that day, Jews always considered Samaritans unclean and unworthy, leprosy or no leprosy. They were always seen as second-class citizens. In their eyes, the Samaritan who returned to Jesus was always going to be an outsider, always unacceptable. And I suspect that reality may have hit him as he was running in this pack of 10 people. He recognized he could keep going forward and face rejection, or turn back to a new vision of living that saw the value and humanity in every single person. So he turned back on an exclusive vision of the world and instead turned to Jesus' vision of the world, a world where healing and hope and love are freely offered to all people, a world where class and race and sexuality and wealth do not matter. The Samaritan turned back to be with Jesus. And what he does, we know very well. We read this every year at Thanksgiving. He praises Jesus, he worships him. His every action lets him know how much his life has been touched. And in every generation, Jesus commends this Samaritan for his faith, saying, "Your faith has made you well." And with that, we see a powerful linkage between faith and gratitude. For the Samaritan, those two are inseparable. For the Samaritan, his faith had to be expressed in words and actions of gratitude and generosity. And Jesus says to us, be like him. The absence of the ability to be grateful reveals self-centeredness. And we live in a day and an age where there's just an overabundance of selfishness in this world. We just read about it in the news all the time. Ingratitude is ugly, It's noticeable and very highly contagious. One of the reasons we gather for worship, though, is to be different, to be a different witness in the world. Everyone who lives a life to serve Jesus, everyone who lives a life dedicated to serving others, is no doubt going to encounter ingratitude all along the way. It can be frustrating, it can be tiring, but the key is never to be derailed by it, and always to remember Jesus is urging us on, saying, keep the faith, let your gratitude shine for the world to see, and it will indeed rub off on others. Golf legend Arnold Palmer died about 2 weeks ago. Okay, some of us were gathered together the day after. We had an Arnold Palmer at lunch in appreciation for Arnold Palmer. But while Arnold Palmer was alive, he talked all the time about how he would encounter professional golfers who didn't appreciate how fortunate of a situation they had. He said players complained to him all the time about how hard it is to constantly have to sign autographs or talk to the press or spend time playing with amateurs. And Palmer said, I tell every single one of them the same thing. If you don't like it, don't walk out of the clubhouse. Quit. No one is forcing you to do this, he would tell them. And he would sigh. He said a lot of players just don't understand how lucky they are to be doing what they're doing. And Palmer would say, and I've saw many interviews in the last couple of weeks, he said, I look at my life and all I can do is be thankful for everything that's been given to me by so many people across all the years. Author John Feinstein said maybe the key to Arnold Palmer was after playing all these years, after winning so many tournaments, after playing golf with so many presidents, after having signed every autograph, after having granted so many interview requests, after making a whole bunch of golfers very wealthy people, he ultimately looks back and doesn't talk about what he did for golf, but what golf and all these wonderful people along the journey did for him. And it's such a powerful metaphor and kind of a reminder what the life of faith is all about. Are we people who are grateful for all God has done for us? Are we people who express our gratitude by our actions of generosity, our actions of thankfulness for the life of other people along the way? I just say those who live with gratitude and express that on an ongoing basis by their words, their deeds, live incredibly extraordinary lives. They're connected to God, they're connected to other people, and they're an inspiration to a world that truly needs inspiration. Amen.